Welcome back. Today we are talking with Robert Hall. And for segment two, this is actually the topic why I reached out to Robert. And it has to do with the UK government resilience framework. You had written an article and I saw the posting, and that's why I reached out to you. So could you tell us what the UK resilience framework is, what it's trying to address? Because as we spoke during the break, what sometimes gets implemented and developed in one part of the world slowly makes its way and has impact in other parts of the world. So I really want people to understand this.
Yes, of course, Alex. And I think it's important to put it in context because it is a specific UK document, and I don't want your audience to miss significance in that regard. Um, well, back in 2021, 2 years ago, the government in the UK decided to conduct what they called an integrated review, which looked at defence, security, and foreign policy across the board and where was the country heading and what needed it to do. In that document, it mentioned that we needed, and it was the first time it stated clearly that we needed a resilience strategy, which was well received. And we have been waiting for 2 years to see what would emerge. So on the 19th of December of last year, a document was published by the government, which took us a little bit by surprise because it was called the United Kingdom Resilience Framework. Not a strategy, a framework. Now, I don't want to get into semantics, but there actually is quite a significant difference between a framework and a strategy. But anyway, we got a framework in front of us. And the aim of the framework was to really strengthen our resilience in order to, and it's a good definition of resilience, to prevent, to mitigate, to respond, and recover from risks in our nation. Now, it's not unique because many other countries, New Zealand and Australia, for example, have been down this path before us. So, we're not marching to a new tune here, but it was new for us. And well, as I say, welcome because nothing had really been done in this regard before. And it had three key or core principles in the framework. And those were openness, prevention, and community. And they went out, timeline was out to 2030. Fortunately, it's, again, picking on the word framework, it really doesn't give firm deliverables. It gives objectives out to 2030, but it doesn't give deliverables. And I suppose as we'll come to looking at the strengths and weaknesses, people are waiting for further outlines as to what will be actually done and who's going to do it. But we'll see. So does that give you an introduction and background to what it's about?
Mm-hmm. I do have a question though. What prompted the idea to even start this? Is that even known? Like, was there a specific event that said, you know what, we need to take a look at this?
Well, I think back in 2021, when the integrated review came out, was a sort of periodic review of our foreign and security policy. That's done not annually, but every sort of period of time, every 5 years or more. And that was a time when it was a good opportunity to look at the world and see the threats facing us. It's before the Ukraine war. But someone had an insight and the motive, and quite right, that we hadn't really, as a nation, addressed resilience. So I think this document was an opportunity to look at it. It did sketch out some very broad outlines of what a resilient strategy should look like. So we were all, as I say, surprised that it came out as a framework, not a strategy.
So what are some of its strengths then? Regardless of how it came out, what are some of the strengths, the really good points that people, communities, organizations are picking up on?
Yeah. Well, as I said, it's a good first attempt at national resilience. The strengths really are that it focuses, as one of the core principles says, on prevention. So it shifts the emphasis from response recovery and response, immediacy, to looking slightly more forward-looking at prevention and preparation. And this was something that people were long asking for, because it takes away the reactive nature of resilience and places it much more on the active, predictive nature of resilience, to look at threats and risks and be more attuned to those. So one of the things it looked at, for example, was saying that we need to move away from looking at 1 and 2 year risks, and we need to look at 5-year risks. Well, I would say, and many others would say, well, we really need to look at 10 and 20 and 30-year risks. Even if they don't materialize, you need to have that long range capability, but at least it was a 5-year look. So, a tick for attempting to be more preparatory and preventative in its approach. That was one strength. Another one that I think was acknowledged was to place more emphasis on standards, which we've looked at in this conversation. But standards both for business and for government. And there might even be a mandatory nature of standards for business, and that's to be explored. But put more of an onus on a wider range of parties who have a best practice and standard against which to measure their resilience and apply it. So that was, again, welcome. And the third strength I think I would identify was the greater use of what we term in this country as local resilience forums. There are 42 in the UK. These are almost county-bound organisations which have a mixture of emergency services, utilities in them, to help with a disaster in their region, with some extra money. And that's always welcome. Mm-hmm. Now, each of those I could unpick, and we have to talk in a minute about weaknesses, but I think it was a good first effort to try and bring more cohesiveness to the resilience field. And I think it's been received well in that regard, although, as we'll come on to, I think there are lots of holes in it that need to be addressed.
And we'll talk about the weaknesses in just a moment. The framework itself, who is it? You mentioned counties and local county governments. Is that who this is directed towards, or is it directed towards and should be adopted by every organization, every government agency or department? Is it something that everyone has to follow, or is there some sort of a guideline saying, companies that are only 250 employees more need to worry about this? Who's it really for, and who should be looking at it?
Well, on the surface, it's about everybody. It is not just one sector, but it's not done all the sectors equally or given them the full attention they deserve. For example, local resilience forums there, but they're very limited in their capability. And government is there to back them up. But there hasn't been really the investment into expanding the government capability, the governance capability. There has been a little, I'm not saying none, but there hasn't been a matching governance capability to oversee this. So when we're talking about a national resilience response, really we would struggle in the UK to mount that. Because although it's talked about all of society resilience response, we still don't have the capability to mount that. And of course, you get down to the arguments of, well, who's going to pay for it and how's it going to be paid for and where the people are going to come from. But those are separate issues. To answer your question, is it directed at everybody? Yes. Is it capable of being applied to everyone? No, is my view.
Is there a time frame around this by any chance?
Yes, it's out to 2030. They've identified some objectives that we're wanting to do in 2025, so 2 years' time. So it's ambitious, but the we will see whether the proof of the pudding is actually in the delivery, and we won't know that unless we have another pandemic, or a war perhaps, or a major crisis, because it won't be tested in the way that it needs to be.
So now let's ask the next question, because you talked about the strengths. What are some of its big weaknesses?
Yeah, well, perhaps I've hinted already, and I don't wish to show my bias, but people have said it's been underwhelming in its approach. I mean, after 2 years, we were expecting something much more its scale, in a scale that really does address the whole of the nation, of society. So it really hasn't matched that yet. But give it fairness, the first stab, we'll see where it goes. But specifically on weaknesses I would identify, which I think your audience might be interested in. Firstly, there's very little mention of adaptation. Now, to me, adaptation is an essential part of resilience. It's how you change your behavior or your attitude in order to be more resilient next time. It does mention adaptation as a word, but it really doesn't think what that means for a resilience framework or strategy. And I think that's a shame, because we talk so much about climate adaptation as a specific threat and a need to adapt well as mitigate. So I would have thought that a framework should address that. That's one that I don't think has been enough yet. The second point I would make is about community resilience and the monies to achieve that. We talked about these local resilience forums, which are the sort of community based. But I think if you are going to talk about a whole of society, then you need to go beyond 42 LRFs. And you need to, how do you engage with 67 million people in the UK? In extreme, you need to get down to almost households and schools and factories and businesses to engage the whole of society. And there isn't really a mechanism for doing that. We have in the UK, I don't know how it is in Canada, but we haven't yet got a system for announcing and calling out all doctors in an area, or bringing together all the factories that can make ventilators. We haven't got that as a cohesive, concentrated plan. So there's a lot to be done, I think, in bringing the community or communities across the country together. The third one is that I think there's a lack of absence for holistic government. And again, I don't know how other countries have it, but we all work on ministries. We've got a Ministry of Health, we've got a Ministry of Defence, we've got a Ministry of Education. Now, some of these threats, pandemic being a good example, cover all those departments. And if you leave resilience to a lead department, say the Ministry of Health or pandemic, it's sometimes quite difficult then to bring in the forces of the other defence, transport, whatever, in a holistic way, other than through, picking up the telephone and ringing up my colleague in the other ministry. So I think the need for, both in this plan and any plan, a way of uniting government departments so that there is a cross-government, high-level engagement, probably with a very senior minister in charge, who has the clout to be able to say to the Ministry of Health or the Ministry, this is what we want and this is how we're going to do it. And we don't have that. And it'd be interesting to see how other countries have that cohesiveness that's really needed for a national plan.
What you were just describing there. It reminds me what happens in organizations where everything gets built in a silo.
Yes.
If there's some sort of an incident, here's the roles and responsibilities for this group. Here's the roles and responsibilities for that group. But for them to really work effectively, they have to be communicating with each other, and they have to break down those silos. And that seems to be the same thing that needs to be considered with this framework going forward as well.
No, you're absolutely right, Alex. But I'm not so naive to suggest that people like working. We have a
Mhm.
sort of inherent defense mechanism and security mechanism by saying, I belong to this department, and I'll work for this department. Um, but I think there's a need to break down some of the solidity of those walls to make them more permeable. People don't seem threatened by sort of abolishing departments, but they have an ability to work with others more cohesively if there's a need to, and exercise perhaps in a way that draws that out. So I think it's not an easy approach, easy to say, but it's not easy to actually do. But I think we do need to do much more to make those silos less obvious.
Yes. Yeah. We have to. Well, I'm sure many of us have experienced it. You're trying to work with somebody, but they just aren't responding properly because they're afraid of their own little empire
Yeah,
getting stamped out, or finger pointing or something happens. So everybody builds up a wall around themselves.
yeah.
And then when something does happen, nobody can see over the wall or get through the wall, and then they can't figure out why things aren't working the way they want them to. But they set themselves up for it.
Yeah, no, it's human behavior, and it's very difficult to change human behavior, to change
Mhm.
attitudes.
Yeah.
But that is what is needed for a cross-government plan. And the pandemic saw it to a degree. I don't know about your country, but certainly ours, that the people were willing to um, get out of their box and work with others. As soon as the pandemic's over, they've gone back to their own box again.
Yeah. Go back to what they're
We,
familiar
we
with.
we don't learn. Yeah.
Yeah. On that note, we've come to the end of our second segment. Today, we're talking with Robert Hall. And in our third segment, we're going to talk about building resilient futures. We'll be right back. If you like that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.